Night story. What I'm about to tell you happened a long time ago. I must have been around 24 years old. Back then, I still lived with my mother and grandmother in the village. Our home was an old wooden house that had rarely been improved over the years. It was a large place with a window on each side. The only part made of concrete was a thin wall that separated the kitchen from the rest of the space. The rooms were only divided by pieces of cloth my grandmother would sew and patch every month on her old sewing machine. We had a backyard that needed to be cleared with a machete every week, because it quickly filled with weeds, snakes, and huge spiders that sometimes crawled down from the roof beams at night, just as you were going to sleep. That never scared us, we were used to it. Our yard bordered a neighbor's crops, and if you crossed 2 more yards and walked about 10 minutes, you reached what we called the canal, a branch of the Magdalena River that curves behind the village. There were 6 of us living in the house. My mom, my grandmother, my uncle with his 2 small children, and me. We survived by selling fish and whatever we grew in the yard, like cassava or pumpkin. Every morning before dawn, I went with my uncle to the canal. The area had thick vegetation, so fish were abundant, but it was also common to run into things that didn't belong to this world. My uncle had a small canoe we kept near the canal. He called it La Gaviota, the seagull, after a girlfriend he once had. We'd go out with a neighbor named Olegario who always worked with us. We started fishing around 2 or 3 in the morning, when the sky turned a deep navy blue and the water seemed calmer than usual. The stillness was so intense, you had to keep yourself busy or smoke tobacco to avoid getting sleepy. My uncle used to say that the calmer the water looked, the more dangerous it was, and he was right. Sometimes the current only brushed the bank so lightly that you'd swear the river wasn't moving at all. But if you put your hand in, the pull was so strong it could almost tear your arm off. We had a usual spot where the current was gentler. We could even leave the canoe unmoored and it wouldn't drift away. It was a series of deep pools formed downstream, right where 3 massive camogen trees grew, big trees with brown ear-shaped pods. Their roots formed diagonal walls that rose over 1 meter high, stretching out like giant fingers into the river. These roots created natural caves where fish and caimans liked to hide. But my uncle always said you couldn't just fish anywhere you pleased. You had to respect nature's signs. If something warned us that we weren't welcome, we had to leave. Sometimes as we arrived, water would suddenly splash on our faces, as if someone had thrown it at us. My uncle said it was the souls of the dead, letting us know they didn't want us there. Other times, when fishing with hooks, the line would suddenly snap, even without a fish biting. That was another sign. Once, we ignored it because we hadn't caught anything, and a snake hidden in a bundle of water plants bit my uncle. He spent a whole month barely able to walk or speak. But the worst happened on the eve of Holy Week. 2 nights in a row, we had great luck. Our canoe was so full of fish that we had to unload them in baskets before continuing. We sold everything before 11 a.m. On the 3rd day when we returned, my uncle, who had been quiet and looking strange all morning, went straight to the backyard. He stripped off his clothes and began bathing with hot water boiled with medicinal plants my grandmother had prepared. He scrubbed his back with the hot branches, repeating the Lord's Prayer over and over. I asked what it was for, but he only said it was a secret. That day he ate lunch and fell into a deep sleep. He didn't wake up the entire day or night. In the early morning I tried to wake him, but he told me without opening his eyes that we couldn't fish, that we had to let things rest. I thought maybe he was just tired. Normally I wouldn't go without him, but that day I thought, well, my uncle has worked hard for us all these years. It's normal for him to feel worn out. I can handle it myself. So I packed my gear and went. When I reached the bank where we kept the canoe, I found Olegario preparing his nets. He said my uncle had told him the same thing, not to go fishing, but there was such a good catch to be had that we decided to ignore him. We paddled for about 40 minutes to the caves. Everything looked the same as before: calm breeze, fish near the surface, the sound of water against the roots. Nothing unusual. We began looking for a spot to cast the first net. Olegario stood, glanced toward the massive branches and asked, "Don't you feel like someone's watching us?" I did, but I didn't want to say anything. Before I could answer, something struck the canoe hard on my side. It was strange because the water there was calm, and if something had drifted toward us, we'd have noticed. The hit was so strong that I nearly fell overboard. When I turned to look, I saw it, a coffin. A black coffin about 2 meters long with white lace sticking out. It looked brand new, perfectly dry on the surface. I froze. When I turned back to tell Olegario, he was gone. It was a huge space with a window on each side. The only room with a cement floor was the kitchen, which also served as the dining room. The rest of the house had a dirt floor, and whenever it rained hard, water would seep through the cracks, forming small puddles. The living room was the largest space in the house, furnished with a few old wooden chairs and a worn-out couch covered with a faded blanket. At night, the creaking of the wooden walls mixed with the howling wind, making the place feel even older than it was. My room was small, with just enough space for a bed, a small table, and a wooden wardrobe that belonged to my grandmother. From my window, I could see the street light flickering, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up reading. The house was silent, except for the occasional sound of the wind rattling the windows. Suddenly, I heard slow, deliberate footsteps on the wooden floor outside my room. At first, I thought it was my grandmother going to the kitchen, but when I called out softly, there was no answer. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. The footsteps lingered for a few seconds, and then, as if the weight had vanished, there was silence. I sat frozen on my bed, my book still open in my hands, my eyes fixed on the door. Minutes passed, but I didn't hear anything else. I eventually convinced myself it had been my imagination and lay down, though sleep came only in short bursts. The next night it happened again. This time the steps were slower, heavier, as if whoever, or whatever, it was wanted me to hear them. They stopped right outside my door, and then I heard a faint, almost imperceptible breathing. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I wanted to call for my mother, but fear had locked my voice inside my throat. I pulled the blanket over my head, praying the thing would go away. After what felt like hours, the breathing stopped. I stayed awake until morning, when the first rays of sunlight slipped into my room, chasing away the shadows. For a few days, nothing happened, and I started to feel safe again. But one stormy night, the sound returned, only this time it came from inside my room. I woke to the sensation that someone was standing right next to my bed. I didn't dare open my eyes. The air was cold, far colder than it should have been, and I could hear that same slow breathing now just inches from my face. Summoning every ounce of courage, I opened my eyes, and saw nothing. But the smell of damp earth filled the room, and the wooden floor beneath my bed creaked as if a heavy weight had just stepped away. The next morning, I asked my grandmother if she had ever heard strange noises in the house. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, "This house has been here for more than 100 years. Things stay in places like this." She didn't say more, and I didn't ask again. From that night on, I never slept with the lights off. And though the footsteps still come from time to time, I've learned not to move, not to speak, and not to open my eyes, because whatever walks in that house at night is not meant to be seen.